I walked into the branch I once built. The glass door closed behind me. A soft click slipped into the room. No one looked up. I took my place in line. 3 ahead. One older woman is behind. The counter's money machine snapped each beat. The air vent hit the back of my neck. Brian Lowell at window 2. He lifted his head. His eyes swept the row. Reached me. Slowed a breath. Then moved on. I held out my card. He didn't raise a hand. What do you need? Low voice. Add transaction. I said it. He tapped the keys. Didn't glance at the card. Other documents. Cut short. I set an envelope on the desk. He pushed it aside. Not clear. Didn't open it. Didn't check. I pulled the correct file. Held it out. He flicked his eyes once. Didn't touch it. Wait. Mrs. Evelyn coughed behind me. Brian turned to her right away. Step up. I stayed at the counter. She looked at me. I nodded. She moved forward. He flipped through her papers. Each motion is steady and fast. No snag. No pause. Done with her. Brian called out. Next. A young man stepped through the door. Not in line. Brian pointed. You. Here. I stood at the counter. My card is still on the desk. The man in the gray shirt near the corner shifted his feet. His hand caught the edge of the chair. His eyes drifted my way. Then, they stayed still. I placed my card back on the desk. A small snap landed. Brian lifted his eyes. He looked at my hand first. Then my face. I was here first. I said it. Your file isn't verified. He answered. The screen in front of him stayed blank. Nothing to verify. He turned the monitor deeper inward. Blocked every angle of view. I'm not serving you. A guard stepped 1 pace closer. His shoe tapped the floor. He stood angled, facing my side of the counter. I said, You haven't checked. Brian pressed his lips. Go to another window. Same tone. I didn't move. I placed 1 finger on the desk edge. He looked at the finger like it was out of place. Don't stand here. He said it. I pulled my hand back. Voices rose behind me. Someone said, Low. He was here first. The line dropped quiet again. Brian hit a key hard. The machine hummed. Request invalid. He read it flat. I looked at him. He turned away. Called the new customer. Submit your papers. His voice softened. Nothing like the one he used on me. I took out my phone. My thumb slid the screen. A code flashed. Then dimmed. No sound. I put the phone away. A cold draft slipped from the back hall. My coat hem shifted. Footsteps approached. Each step is set apart. Not rushed. The guard changed stance. Feet together. Eyes aimed past me. I straightened my collar. The seam aligned. My chest rose once. Mrs. Evelyn walked past. Her neck turned slightly toward me. Then she left the counter. I held my place. My feet are on the tile line. My arms are down at my sides. Brian lifted his head. Saw I hadn't moved. You're still there? He asked. I'm waiting. I said. I told you. No service. He answered. Didn't meet my eyes. At the far end, a metal chair slid. Sharp sound. Footsteps came closer. Heavier than regular customers. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the desk edge. A scratch 2 inches long cut across the wood. The light made it stand out. Brian looked past my shoulder. His mouth stopped mid-shape. His spine straightened. Both hands were placed flat on the desk. People in line quieted. A clerk at window 3 froze mid-motion. The money machine went silent. I heard someone breathe behind me. Not a customer. Not the guard. Brian spoke more slowly. What do you want now? I didn't answer. I stood still. The space behind me is less than an arm's length. No one moved. My watch buzzed once. A short signal. No light. No display. Just a shift in the air. Until one call changed everything. I didn't turn. No need. The room had already changed its posture. Looked at me differently. Looked at him differently. Have you ever watched a room realize they dismissed the wrong man? The footsteps behind me stopped. The person behind returned to the exact spot. No one in the room spoke again. Brian tightened his grip on the desk. His fingers slid across the wood. His eyes aimed over my shoulder. A low voice sounded from behind. What's this counter handling? 3 customers near the door turned at once. Brian drew a short breath. No issue. His voice stumbled at the end. I said, I stood in the right order. The man behind replied, I saw. Charles Dean stepped beside me. He set 2 fingers on the counter, close to my card. Brian looked at Charles, then dropped his gaze. I doubt this man's file. Charles asked, What section are you using? Brian opened his mouth. A bit of air pushed out, then died. A woman digging in her purse froze. Her zipper was held halfway. Charles raised his radio. Nina to counter 2. Less than 1 minute. Nina Fox arrived. Her tablet lit up. She stood between Brian and me. Brian pulled at his badge, lanyard. Then, let go. The clip snapped back against his shirt. Nina asked, What data do you need? Charles pointed at my card. This file, and all declined transactions at this counter for 2 months. Nina opened the log. Her fingers moved non-stop across the screen. Brian cut in. I followed protocol. Nina didn't look up. 8 declined. She said it. Brian rolled his shoulder. They had issues. Nina switched tabs. 6 share the same attribute. She handed the screen to Charles. Charles looked for a few seconds. His finger tapped the desk once. Brian gripped the chair edge. I didn't sort anyone. Nina opened the camera. Counter 2. 2 months. Brian reached to block it. Charles placed a hand on his wrist. Brian pulled back. The screen showed each clip. Brian is skipping customers in line. Brian is calling the new arrivals. Brian pushes files aside. Unread. A man whispered, That's how he works. Brian looked at me. You're making this up. Charles asked. Who do you think ordered the review? Brian stared at his shoes. Then back up. His jaw twitched. I set my card on the counter. The card hit with one clean sound. Nina looked at it. She read the name. Her hand stopped. She passed the device to Charles. Charles tapped the file. The access light blinked in the corner. Brian shot to his feet. That name? His mouth opened. No words. Only air breaking in fragments. Nina said, He oversees the entire system. 2 clerks at window 3 froze. A pen hit a customer's desk with a snap. Samantha Kerr stepped out from the side hall. She stood next to Charles. She looked at Brian. Then at the screen. You did this again? She asked. Brian shook his head hard. I followed procedure. Samantha set a file stack on his desk. The pages landed with a low thud. Procedure doesn't let you pick customers, she said. A customer behind shifted half a step right. Brian pointed at me. He's dressed like he's not a client. I turned the card. The printed face turned toward him. Brian looked. His breath cut short. His eyes blinked fast. Samantha bent toward the card. She read the name. She straightened. Mr. Clay. A younger customer lowered his phone to his leg. The guard shifted weight to his right foot. Brian looked around. No one met his eyes. He stepped back half a pace. His back hit the chair. Charles asked, How do you explain the 8 cases? Brian parted his lips. No sound. His tongue touched his teeth, then stopped. Air escaped without forming a word. Samantha said, I warned you twice. You didn't correct it. Brian turned to her. You want me gone? She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on him. I picked up my card, slipped it into my coat pocket. An older man stood up. His chair slid a short distance. No one processed papers. No one asked for numbers. Everyone stayed where they were. Charles looked at me. You choose the next step. Brian pressed both hands on the desk edge. His knuckles turned pale. I said, "Call every supervisor on this floor." The guard cleared a path. Samantha raised her phone. Nina closed her tablet. Charles stepped back half a pace for room. Brian kept his hands on the desk. He opened his mouth again. No words formed. Chairs offline. Pens dropped. The money counter still dark. No one resumed business. Every eye in the room fixed on counter 2 without needing a cue. Sometimes a whole room pauses because truth finally walks in. The guard opened a path. The floor managers gathered at the counter. 4 people. 2 men. 2 women. All standing straight. Eyes on me. Brian still gripped the desk edge. His fingers slid up and down the worn strip of wood. He tried to speak. I didn't mean, but the sound broke halfway. I stepped forward 1 pace. Close enough to set my card down without reaching. I dropped the card on the counter. The wood snapped back with a clean click. The managers looked at the card on instinct. Samantha stood beside me. She tightened her hold on the file. Said nothing. Offered nothing. Charles Dean lowered his hand to his belt. He tilted his head toward Brian. "Hand over your tools." Brian edged back half a step. His foot hit the chair behind him. The chair rocked once. I can explain," I said. "No need." Brian swallowed once. He held out his access badge. His hand shook. The badge slipped midway. Plastic hit wood. A short, sharp sound. Charles picked it up. He set it on the next desk. Farther from Brian than required. I said, "Remove counter 2 permissions." One manager opened the console at the side station. He typed 4 characters. The screen blinked. Then dimmed. No alert tone. Brian blinked fast. He slid back another half step. His back met the glass wall. I didn't look at him. I looked at Samantha. "He ends today." Samantha nodded. She wrote on her sheet. 1 straight line down the margin. The guard stood behind Brian. Not touching. Just holding the position of someone about to escort. Brian opened his mouth. Who are you two?" Before he finished, Samantha turned the screen. My name showed with top-tier access. He froze. Mouth open. No air is moving out. The floor managers stared at the screen a few seconds longer. They stepped back 1 pace. All of them. In sync. I said, "Who signed this protocol?" Samantha opened the folder. She placed a page in front of me. My signature sat at the lower corner. I rotated the document. Apply across the system. Nina stepped forward. She opened her tablet. "Program name?" she asked. I set 1 finger on the desk. Slow. Straight. Respect first. Nina entered the 3 words. Her device vibrated. The update appeared in the corner of the counter display. The floor managers waited. No motion except breath. I said, "Retrain. Today." Samantha nodded. "Yes." Brian tried to stand tall. He opened his mouth. "Can you give me?" I cut in. "Human resources. Now." The guard stepped forward. Brian backed up until his shoulders hit the wall. He looked around the room. No one looked back. He followed the guard out the rear door. His shoes scraped lightly across the floor. The door closed. The hinge carried a long, slow sound. I turned to the managers. First come. First served. No exceptions. One manager answered, "Understood." I looked at Nina. "Review the complaint data." Nina opened the file. Her hand moved down a long column. 3 customers, unresolved. She said, "Call them." I said. Samantha lifted her phone. She read the 3 names. Nothing added. Mrs. Evelyn walked forward. Her bag was tight to her side. She looked at me. Then at the return card. I nodded once. "Please," I said. A teller opened a new counter. He placed his hand on the desk. Waiting for her. No rush. No extra question. I stepped back. Charles stood beside me. Hands behind him. Samantha is on my left. holding the file. 9 on my right. Tablet, leet. A complete line. No one raised their voice. No one asked again. I scanned the room. Customers in order. Chairs straight. Papers returned to their place. No cutting lines. No side looks. I said, "Resume operations." A teller called a number. 4, 6. Clear voice. No hesitation. I pulled the card from my pocket. Set it back inside my coat. The fabric flattened in one clean line. Charles said, "We'll monitor from here." I nodded once. Nothing more. I walked to the front door. Samantha took 2 steps, then stopped behind me. She didn't call my name. She just stood to keep the room steady. The glass door opened. Street air moved in, carrying the scent of new plastic from the sign outside. I stepped out. Didn't look back. One branch of mine. One day off course. One morning. Realigned. No need for noise. Just the right person in the right spot. If you like quiet authority shaped this way. Black CEO Tales is where I tell stories of men underestimated. Then, shifting an entire room with one small move. Subscribe. Don't miss the next moment someone resets the space. Black CEO Tales. Quiet power. Loud consequences.